Find the freedom. Go to the freedom. Yeah, that's where God is. God is a God of liberation.
The Change Podcast. Everything changes, everything stays the same. Welcome back to the Change Podcast. I am Shane Clifton, and it's my great pleasure to do a tag team interview following on from Gem with the wonderful Steff Fenton. Hey again, Steff.
Hello again. Thanks for having me again.
It's so delightful. It was such a rich conversation that you had with Gem, and I was really pleased to listen to it. And it's interesting because the three of us are connected in different ways. So you and Gem share a queer journey, actually in relatively similar stages of it. I'm a boring cisgender man.
So boring, honestly.
That's right. But we share a Christian tradition and an experience of church and of alienation from church. And I think maybe you've done a better job of it than me, but an attempt to reclaim that connection with church. So
just different, you know. You don't have to say good or bad.
No, maybe you're at a point that I'd like to get to, but aren't quite at yet. Maybe that's a way of saying it. So that's where we're going to sort of focus this. So, I guess being queer and Christian isn't an easy experience and can be traumatic. In fact, to even say being a queer Christian for most of the circles in which you and I have moved in for a lot of our life is an oxymoron. Those two words don't go together. And I've really, I've spoken to and interviewed a lot of queer people over the years in my various roles with this and watched them experience trauma. And so I'd really, I'd like to sort of share a bit of that with the group, not just negatively, because this has got a positive ending to it as well. But what was the experience? Initially said you came out gay as lesbian. So what was the experience of coming out like for you in the church?
Yeah, so I had grown up in the evangelical church, was a pretty big part of my community. I remember a year before coming out as gay to my minister, he had taken me out for lunch and said, "Hey, Steff, you're one of three core leaders of our community. Like, you are just such a pillar. If you weren't here, I don't know, this church would kind of collapse."
How old were you at this point?
It was in uni.
Yeah.
So early 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
so he had that told you felt that sense of call on your life as well, that call to serve and lead. And
I guess I just fell into it, but I've always had people affirm a sense of leadership in me, and felt like to those whom much is given, much will be required. Always felt like something over my life that I'd been given a lot. Like I was gifted in some way, or had a lot of gifts to share with the world. So I guess naturally just fell into a leadership space in the church. Played music, led services when I was younger. My dad's an Anglican minister, which is probably a bit of a contribution as to why I felt so comfortable in church.
Yeah.
So very...
Have you always known you were gay? I should ask that question. So when he's saying this at this time, were you already feeling uncomfortable with what that might mean for you? Or
I'm really thankful I was so blissfully unaware for 19 years of my life. So grew up in Tamworth, and I think coming out as gay in a Christian church in Tamworth, I don't know if that would have been worse than in the Sydney Anglican Church. Hard to know. Apples and oranges, maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know.
It has its advantages. Sydney Anglican can be very doctrinaire. So,
yeah. But yeah, no, it was about 19 when, when I fell into a relationship. No one knew about it at that time. I was deeply ashamed. I thought this is the worst thing that I could do with my life. I have the darkest thing inside of me, the darkest evil. Like, this sin is so much and so overwhelming. Who the heck am I? I'm so bad. I'm so terrible. Why do I keep doing these things?
It's such a destructive feeling to give a person. And, we talk about, you were talking to Jeremy about not harming people and how do you know when you're doing the right thing? And the church just hasn't asked itself that question, what's the harm? Where is the harm in this relationship, in the churches or in this person's sexuality? And the harm is that deep sense of guilt and shame and repression, and then a cycle of acting out and feeling worse because you're just being who you are and being made to feel bad about it.
Yeah, and in a sense, the church locks you into a space where you don't think any expression of who you are can ever be good, so why would you try? And yeah, it doesn't promote self-learning or growth or the ability to say, hey, I can bring my faith into this space and I can bring the things which I think are really important and grow as a person in my whole personhood. And so I think for years, a lot of us who are queer are just so unhealthy and expressing ourselves in ways that hurt others and hurt ourselves because we don't ever get told, oh, actually, there could be something really reformed and transformative in your sexuality and in your sex life and in your relationships. And it could be something really beautiful to come out of it.
Yeah. It's interesting how repression leads to cycles of self-destruction and unhealthy behavior. And I've spoken to so many people who've talked about, that cycle. So you did find yourself trapped in that to some degree.
Yeah. There were periods where I just suppressed that part of myself and thought, I have to lock this in a box. And, for a period of my life, it was about trying to pray it away and it wouldn't. And then there was I've got to live with this, but not act on it. And
like in the conversion therapy sort of system, or was it the celibate sort of movement going around at that point?
Yeah, no formal conversion therapy, though, was given a lot of books to read within that framework. And I was praying that in my own personal life. I'd rock up to church and just feel like I was being judged to my core for being who I am and, just being in that space. It was, I'd leave church most weeks in tears and just be like, so I was around that ideology. I wasn't ever in a formal space of, someone praying with me or counseling me through that, though was pastorally pushed towards that space. And
so what happened when you came out a year later to your pastor?
Yeah, that's where we started, isn't it? It was like in a moment, everything about who I was just shifted from being one of the most positive influences in a community and one of the greatest leaders and one of, all of those things, to instantly being the complete opposite and being one of the most threatening people in the space, someone who could at any moment tear this community apart, who couldn't be trusted to be up the front, who needed to be removed from leadership and shown to be someone not to look to. It was a split second to be the complete opposite of what I was a moment before I had spoken the words.
Yeah, it's so hard to imagine what that must feel like, because this is your community, this is your family, these are the people you love, and all of a sudden you're considered a threat and find yourself on the outside.
Yeah.
What were some of the practical ways in which that played out?
Yeah, so I was leading services regularly, leading a music team, part of a Bible study. I, was just completely removed from all of those. And I think one of the most important things in the middle of it is the fact that I was struggling so much with my own sexuality and faith, and to be questioning whether was there still a place for me here? Could I still be part of this? And then for the only message for me to receive is actually all of those things that you're questioning, we're actually going to confirm all of them and not ask you, how are you going at any point?
Yeah, it's
for
so
years.
stunning that the inability of doctrine-driven people to see the person and feel their pain or see the damage that's being done. It's just so contradictory to what the Christian gospel you were talking about last podcast with Jem should be about. And my experience of watching gay Christians come out is often they are so much more deeply spiritual, and they dig into their faith and they cry out to God so much more than this community that's condemning them. I see God in queer Christians so much more obviously than in the self-righteous judges.
Yeah, and I think it's different for everyone, but for me, I couldn't rely on anyone anymore, and I couldn't rely on what other people were saying about me anymore, but the only thing I could rely on was what God was saying about me, and saying that there is still space for you and there is still love for you and your identity is in the image of God. And, at that point in my life, Jesus has died for you, and sacrificed himself for you. Now I would view atonement a little differently, but I just knew that I was caught up in that, and nothing could change that. And so it was the church that hurt me so much. It was my faith that saved me through that, and my depth of knowing who I was, or my depth of relying or relating to God, just as you say, it got to the core and I just hung on there.
Yeah, that's great.
And it got so deep.
That's not everyone's journey. Some people get chased away from that.
Yeah.
But for you, it drew you in closer. Did you discover other queer Christians at that sort of point in time that helped you along that journey as well?
It took a few years.
Really?
Yeah. So I thought I was the only person for a while. And it's amazing that people still today can think they're the only queer Christian or only person. That's how much we have shunned people to the dark places of the church, that there are literally so many of us around, and that you can still feel so alone. But yeah, finding people was a real switch for me. Also reading people who read the Bible differently, and understanding that scripture and stories that had been, I will say, weaponized against me were then interpreted and applied in different ways, or there was different meanings that people took from that. And, that springboarded me into, well, I guess we can read scripture differently then, and there must be different traditions out there, So, It's
amazing how, again, what's happened here is this queer experience for you opens up your theological horizons in ways that are actually rich, that leave you with a bigger God, a more open spirit. And fundamentalism sort of does the opposite to that, doesn't it? It creates a very little and narrow God. And so it's a difficult journey, but in many ways you must be thankful to have gone through it, because it's sort of blown open your world.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I think I was just trying to describe the experience, and it starts off like negative, like abusive, traumatic, like hard, difficult. transformative, expansive, growth-provoking. It's just like that journey out is one that is so incredibly difficult and so harmful, and I wouldn't wish upon anyone, and I wish there was a different way of getting there.
Yeah.
But then it pushes you out to say, actually, well, I can't really be sure of too much, or if I've been excluded, who have I excluded? And what ways have I thought about other people who are different to me, for which their experience is the same as what I've experienced? All those questions unfold to the point where you're out there and you're like, well, I don't know what I know much anymore.
Yeah, which is a scary space, but maybe also a liberating space. So for you, it's led to, as you say, an enriching of your faith. Did you manage to find? I'm getting a phone call. Are you hearing it? It's not coming through my phone? Hey? What were we up to? That really was the biggest disruption. We were going pretty good. We were on fire.
We were going
Steph.
really well. I think it was like I was talking about how it got I got to a point where I didn't really know what I knew anymore.
Yeah. I'm just going to have to work out how to re-edit this with a phone call in it or something, aren't I? Because we literally stopped mid-sentence. All right, I'm going to work out how to edit that, and from here on, we'll sort of go on. So I think what I was asking you, so you started to find some new accepting Christian spaces, or actually that was really hard, and the only real way you've been able to do this is to create one yourself?
Yeah, maybe both. Maybe both. Yeah. I think I found spaces, that were inclusive. I saw people living queerness and their faith together. I think what is it that was not there? It's interesting. I in my Master's of Divinity in studying, when I started that, I was at a point in my faith where I had kind of said, well, I know I don't believe what I used to believe. And I've got to a point where, okay, if those things can be untrue, then what else is untrue? And I don't think but I don't know what do I add in? What do I put back in? And I think my Master's of Divinity was a rich exploration into, a brief introduction into the breadth of the Christian tradition and how vast theology and biblical scholarship could go. Yeah. And it was a really beautiful deep dive where I put some really wonderful foundations back into my faith, but then have been springboarded into a space of like thinking freer and asking bigger questions. And I think that's not a space that I see much of.
It should be. It's interesting. I taught theology for 20 years before whatever happened. But I used to tell my students what theology should be is a deconstruction of narrow and often oppressive categories that you've just taken as a given, as assumed truth, and then a reconstruction, but that reconstruction needs to be, or if it's, I think if it's informed by a big God, needs to be humbler, more open, more loose. And that should be what maturity in life is about. So our faith journey should reflect that. But Christian theology and Christian churches, I guess, just too often are immature. And it's interesting, you were talking to Jem in the previous podcast about authenticity, and I've been sort of reflecting on the way in which, strangely, too much Christian theology and too many Christians breed inauthenticity because they've got these fixed doctrines and categories around which you're not allowed to think differently. And if you do, the only way in which you can do that is to sort of do it quietly and put on a pretense. So you put on a mask when you go in the church, or you're forced to leave. So you've got these spaces that should be about experiencing the love and the truth and the beauty of God that instead breed a false mask. And it's interesting, if the trans journey is about shedding that false mask and embracing your true self, you'd like to think the Christian journey should be about that we should be able to be authentic and open and honest. But for some reason, church spaces aren't allowing that. And I know for a fact that there's pastors who would want to be queer friendly, but aren't game to do it because, well, they're not allowed to. And there's people in congregations who'd like to think differently, but they're not allowed to talk about these things. Or there's gay people in congregations who are alone, who think they're the only one experiencing these things. And it's a tragedy, isn't it?
It really is. And we could probably be here for, hours just listing the amount of questions and the breadth of conversation and diverse thinking and questioning that, Christians could have if they let themselves. And even with the experience that we have in this room and the questions that we've explored like that, we go on for hours just having conversations that in churches no one's ever allowed to have.
I know. And what a loss, how rich those conversations are and deep and meaningful.
They really are. Yeah. Yeah. It's it's a real shame. And I think the image that I always stick to, and I'm not sure if it's a good one or a bad one, but the image of the wilderness and God showing up so much in the wilderness or calling people to the wilderness has been so affirming for me as I have just taken one step out and out and out, being like, holy crap, have I really given away that doctrine? And now I'm giving away this doctrine. And now I'm thinking this. And now I'm really open to all those things. And, now I'm out here and I'm like, well, it feels like it's been a faithful journey out here. I feel like I've just put one step out in front of the other, and it feels like I'm following Jesus in this direction, but no one else is coming with me.
It's interesting because when I used to talk to students in the very early days of accepting gender, accepting men and women as women not having to submit to men, so critiquing something as simple as male headship, people would always say, well, I can't do that because it's going to lead me to accepting gays. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, maybe that's a good thing, but it's really interesting, isn't it, how people are unwilling to take one step to a truth because of fear for where they might end up. And actually that's an unwillingness to follow where the Spirit is leading.
Yeah. Yep. And I think you've named the core word there, Shane, of fear. That's so much a part of that. Those churches or those spaces is led by fear of, that's exactly how the conversations go is, well, that's the slippery slope to accepting that is then all of this. When actually in my experience, it's actually, I'm saying actually, no, can you just make space for me? That's what I'm asking you to do here. And then once you've made space for me, can you see that you could make space for this person? And I think it's often the contrast between ideas and an academic and a thinking faith, and one that is truly relational and incarnational, I think. And when we're actually willing to get into the messiness of life and see that it's diverse and complex and can't fit it into boxes, and that's just life and God's here.
Yeah.
And what will I find here?
Yeah. I mean, and I think people actually do want to go there. I think there is, but people always say, I want to love the person, love the person, hate the sin, or they just can't help but default to these ways of thinking and can't recognize how dehumanizing just language and talk like that is, and how that isn't accepting. I mean, how does that sort of language make you feel?
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that. I'm like, oh, we need to define sin then, right? Because we'd all have different understandings of sin, and then we get into a bucket of, all different ideas of sin. But yeah, I think I'm and this is part of starting a new church and trying to do something new and reclaiming faith. And I think I was part of this talk the other day about building a Christianity or a church that you're genuinely proud of. Like, so many people are not proud of their faith or want to hide parts of it or explain parts of it away.
I get that.
100%.
It's homophobic and, for this world that we live in rightly, that's seen as the equivalent of racism. And it's sexist. So many churches don't ordain women. There's a lot to be embarrassed about. Let's just be honest about that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so then building a faith that you do want other people that you say, actually, I am unabashedly part of this Jesus thing. And I'm unabashedly a part of it. And I'm so proud of it because Jesus is X, Y, Z, or this movement is X, Y, Z, or my church is X, Y, Z. And it is so beautiful. And I think if you come, you won't be able to fault it, like to be able to just be like, yes, yes, yes. Like, and even if no, still yes. Like, even if you're not on board, like still there's still space. It's overflowing. It's abundant. It's affirming. It's all those things, incredibly confronting.
It's a hard journey to build a church like that. As you know, I've been involved in a church that I loved, a church called Home. I think one of your housemates was part of it,
That's
Hank.
it.
And Seb,
hey, Hank.
Seb and Amy led the transition of that church, just wonderful people. I was helping them sort of walk the journey of changing their thinking, and it was just a really excellent journey, and we loved being in that church, but it was hard to sustain the church because one thing often about sort of opening up people's horizons is, they feel liberated. They no longer feel the guilt of having to do things and the control that sometimes comes in church environment, and they just feel liberated and they don't stay. So it's hard to build and often it's interesting. I sometimes wonder whether the reason pastors are not willing to be inclusive and to stop causing trauma and to ask questions is because fundamentalism is easier. So how do you make it work, Steph?
Yeah, it's easy to control people in the fundamental realm, isn't it? Yeah. We struggled with that a little bit at New City, but don't as well. Like I think people have come with very diverse experiences of church and carrying a lot of trauma and harm, and church is a hard place to be, and they're exploring different levels of their own faith that can be difficult or painful, and some people just genuinely need a break and need a rest. Also, I think we've been really strong about people coming in and resting with the specific intention that you've probably been exploited by your church to serve to the point where you've been burnt out. So don't do that when you come here.
Yeah.
So we're probably doing ourselves a disservice there too.
Maybe it helps that your goal isn't to create an institution, but to build a community which is fluid, and whatever that works out to be is okay. And that makes people nervous as well. But it's, you'd hope that the gospel could be that as well, wouldn't you?
And I think that's a key word, is building a community that is genuinely life-giving. If you do that, people are going to want to be part of it. And what a better reason, or what a beautiful reason to have people choose to be involved, or versus you must sign up, or there's an expectation to do this.
Because if you don't, people are going to hell, or it's amazing the motivations that drive people.
Yeah, we should really get more on the hell thing, shouldn't we?
Look, we can talk about that motivation. Another day, but So one of the interesting things you talked about to me before this podcast was in your church, you were ordained. And talk to me about what that meant to you coming from your other experience, what it means to be a pastor and to receive that recognition.
Yeah. So ordained.
Is ordained the right word? What
ordained
are we using?
In the sense of very informal recognition of my role as a pastor in the community. And so that was basically I stood in the middle of our community, and people just affirmed who they see me to be in that space. And it was so moving to be there. And I'm even feeling it in my eyes at the moment that to be told for so many years that your influence in a community is negative and you are leading people astray and you can't be trusted and you shouldn't use your voice and you shouldn't share your story, and so much a part of you is sinful and wrong, to then be in a space where people are saying things like, your encouragement or you're empowering, or you're just affirming that actually, no, Steff, we see you and we see who you are and we appreciate you and thank you for being who you are, and we want you in this role in our community because, of course, you're a pastor here.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. And I can see that they say, your community is saying that because they're responding to the fruit of the Spirit in your life. Despite what the church has called you, you've lived faith, love, truth, gentleness, kindness, self-control, and so your community has responded to that. And it's so wonderful and rich. And I'm really stoked I've got to come to your community. I've told you this 100 times. I've just got to actually do it. I live a way away, but that's a poor excuse.
Yeah. It's it's been an incredibly healing part of my faith experience, leaving the Anglican Church and starting something new that is just the church that we needed. Yeah.
Look, and I understand some people need to stay within those churches and try to change them. I've tried that for many years.
Me too.
But I'm also a bit pessimistic that some of these churches want to or can be changed. And for the sake of people not experiencing trauma and for the sake of you being able to flourish and thrive and help others to flourish and thrive, I'm just stoked that you can build a new community and be part of something that's thriving. So
yeah, me too. Yep. And it does have its challenges, as you say. You set people free, and then, well, where are they going to go? Are they going to stick around at all and be committed?
But that doesn't matter.
No,
because you've set them free.
Yes, yeah.
Then you've not set them free; they've set themselves free, and God set them free. But you've been part of the journey.
Yeah,
and you might not have much to do with that person, and then 10 years down the track, they'll come to you and they'll say, "Just that, 6 months I spent with you changed my life."
Yeah, and I think I've reached this point where, when you kind of remove yourself and your control over other people, so rather than be in a church as a pastor who is saying, to be a Christian, you need to do X, Y, Z and fulfill X, Y, Z and believe X, Y, Z. I think people are just going to, whether you tell them or not, have their own experiences in life and have their own questions. And maybe, as you say, they will exist in your space while they mask all of this questioning or all of this doubt, or, be incredibly unhappy like me, be shoving a part of themselves deep down inside them because I think they have to do that in order to find belonging and identity here. Versus then this other expression where you say, well, we're going to believe differently, or there's space to disagree. You don't have to be committed. You don't have to do X, Y, Z. Like, let's find this space together and question together. And let me actually just create space for you to explore this in however that looks. I think people are just going to be doing all that stuff anyway. And what's a better way to just exist in the church sphere than just to kind of be around and be unconditionally accepting and around and open if anyone wants to come with a question, or if someone does want to be involved, or if, freely kind of being part of this. I'm just like, maybe maybe I won't see you for another 10 years. And maybe someone, another minister would say, well, that was a loss. Versus like, well, isn't it a loss that someone spends 10 years? It's just these
trapped
different
in your system of control. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, it's so good.
I don't know if
Steff.
that makes sense, but yeah.
Well, look, this is going to be a slightly shorter podcast because you've actually been talking for an hour and a half.
Very thoroughly, enjoyably, may I add.
It's so fantastic. Look, I'm sure Gem and I are going to hit you up at some point in the future to come and talk again because, it's just great to talk to friends and have rich conversations. So
it is. Yeah, thanks so much for
having me. Anything else you want to say about church and what? If you want to say anything else, and then we'll finish up.
Oh, I don't know. Just be free.
Yeah.
Yep. Find the freedom. Go to the freedom. Yeah. That's where God is. God is a God of liberation.
Very good. All right. Peace and goodwill. And until next time.
See you then.
The Change Podcast. Everything changes, everything stays